so the next lecture is a continuation of image segmentation, and we have already studied like a couple of algorithms which can be used for image segmentation. And today we are going to talk about clustering. And clustering is like it's a well-known algorithm in machine learning area, but today we will see like how that clustering algorithm can be used specifically to solve this image segmentation task. Okay, so basically we will talk about two different algorithms. The first one is k-means clustering. The second one is mean shift. And for k-means, I think the algorithm which is used for this image segmentation, that's called SLIC. The full form, I think, is simple linear iterative clustering. And you will see like it's really very simple algorithm. And then we'll talk about like what are the limitations and how mean shift can be useful in some of the scenarios. All right, so before going to the segmentation part, let's first try to understand like the motivation behind clustering, why exactly we need to do clustering. Clustering, it's like a very general approach. The idea is if you have like some samples or some data points, what you want to do is you want to organize those data points into different groups. Okay, and that organization is termed as clustering. Now, the goal is when you organize those data points into those clusters, you have two different objectives. And these two objectives could be like your loss terms, which you try to minimize when you perform clustering. Okay, so the first objective is you want like very high intra-class similarity. Now, what do we mean by intra-class similarity? If two different samples are actually belonging to the same cluster, it means that they should be very similar to each other. All right. So if you have to compute like some kind of number to say that what's your intra-class similarity, then it will be something like you will try to find out pairwise similarity of all the samples which are there in the cluster. Okay. And when you try to average that, that similarity measure should be pretty high. If it's high, then it means like your clustering algorithm is pretty good. Okay, so that's the first objective. The second objective is when you try to compute the same kind of similarity between samples which are across different classes or across different clusters, you should get very low score, which means that if samples are not similar to each other, they should belong to two different clusters. All right, so they're kind of related to each other, but two different objectives altogether. Okay, so we'll try to optimize these two when we talk about these clustering algorithms. Now, another interesting aspect is clustering is it's like from unsupervised algorithms category, right? And in this algorithm, we don't need any labels. For example, like some of the tasks which we have been studying, for example, classification, object detection, you have seen that, okay, to be able to do classification, whether it's classical approach, for example, SVM, or it's like a deep learning approach where you're training a CNN, you do need some kind of class labels on those images, right? And you use those labels to actually compute your loss function and then train your model. Now, in case of clustering, you don't need any labels. So it's completely unsupervised. All right. And even if you think about like these two objectives, you can compute like these two by itself. You don't need labels for that. Okay, so you directly learn from data itself. Now, let's see like some simple examples, try to understand what clustering will do to different kind of problems. And again, it depends on like what's your objective. So for example, we have like all these characters from, let's say, some comic. And again, so each of these individuals is, let's say, your sample point. And now you have to solve some kind of clustering problem. And you will see that depending upon what your objective is, your clustering results will be different. Okay, so for example, let's say we want to perform clustering based on family members. So our two clusters are, the first is like this Simpsons family, and the second is the school employees. So if we use these two as clusters, the result which you will obtain is something like this. All these are school employees, and all these are like Simpsons family. Okay, so that was the objective you had to solve. And again, if you had to solve, and again, your samples are not changing, you're just changing the objective. In this case, we are saying that we want two different clusters. The first cluster belongs to females and the second cluster belongs to males. And again, you can see the same data set, so the same sample points, your clustering results are different. Okay, so it really matters like what you truly want to achieve. And for that, the core component of clustering is the similarity measure. How will you compute similarity? Okay, so in this particular case, like if you're looking for females, then the features which you will be interested in is like female attributes, which define this property. Okay, for example, in this case, the images I'm showing, visually, like both of these images are almost similar, right? If you look at the color tone, it's very similar. Even if you look at the texture, it's pretty similar. But again, depending upon what you want to achieve, these two images might go to different clusters or they might go to the same cluster. Okay, for example, let's say if you have to categorize like objects based on whether the hair are brown or curly, then they might go into the same category. On the other hand, if we have to cluster, okay, we want to separate like animals versus maybe humans or dogs versus females, right? Then they will fall into different clusters. So it boils down to like what kind of problem you want to solve and how will you determine that similarity score between different samples. So for example, when I said like if you're looking into like hair, whether they're curly or not, whether they are brown or not, then the similarity measure could be like you might want to detect these kind of features, right? Whether you have curly hairs or not. You don't care whether this is a dog or this person. And if it's like a human versus animal, then again you will look into different kind of features for that. Okay, and again, so depending upon that, you might have to choose like different kind of features. Features could be based on colors, intensity, location, texture, and a lot of other factors. Now, even if you have the features, then the next question is how you're going to actually say that two different samples are similar. To be able to do that, you need some kind of similarity, or you can say like distance metric, right? So the idea will be given two samples. You will have some kind of function which will take these two samples as input, and it's going to extract some features. We don't know what features it will be looking into, and it's going to give you some kind of numbers. And this number will be used to estimate whether these two samples are similar or not. All right. Similarly, you can have like two different words, and you might get like some kind of number for that, whether they're similar or not. And again, this function will vary from problem to problem. It will depend upon what kind of features you're looking into. And then again, how you're matching those features. Okay, so you need this kind of distance metric to perform clustering. And this is a very interesting problem if you look at these two examples on the right. So these two are like, let's say words, but maybe in different languages. And they might mean similar things. So the semantic meaning is not changing, which means that if you're looking into semantics of these words, you might get like a very high similarity score, or you can say like very small distance measure, right? But if you want to differentiate between different languages, like whether these words come from different languages or not, or same language or not, then again, you might need a function which will give you like a number which is pretty high. All right. Now, if you look at these two images, so this is like a fingerprint fingerprint image, right, from a scanner. Now, as a human, if you look into these two images, I mean, both are fingerprint. Okay, so now if you just want to say that whether these are fingerprint images or not, we can say they are pretty much similar. But in like from application point of view, we might not be interested in that because that's trivial. These are fingerprints. What we might be interested in is whether these two fingerprints are coming from the same individual or not. And if they are not, then we need like some kind of metric function which says that, okay, these fingerprints are from different individuals. So it boils down to what you want to achieve, and that will determine what kind of function, what kind of features you're going to use. Okay, so that was like the motivation or some of the background which you need for clustering. Let's directly jump into k-means algorithm, and then later we'll see how we can use k-means algorithm for this segmentation problem. All right. Again, k-means is a very popular algorithm for clustering. And the idea is pretty simple. What we want to do is we have like some set of sample points, and we want to start with, all right, so in this data set, let's say we have 10 different categories or 10 different clusters. So that's the starting point which we need for k-means, and that's one of the limitation. Beforehand, we need to know how many different categories we have in our data set. And then the end goal is you will distribute each of that sample point to one of those categories. And that's what the k-means algorithm is going to do for you. Okay. The basic algorithm, it's a iterative algorithm, which means that you start with like some cluster centers and you perform assignment. You say that, okay, this sample belongs to this cluster. So you assign all the samples in your data set to one of those clusters. And then you keep repeating that process, which like iteratively improves that cluster assignment. And at the end, the two objectives which we discussed, where we are focusing on like low similarity for intra-class samples and high similarity for intra-class samples and very low similarity for inter-class samples. So we try to meet those two objectives, and then we end when we can't improve it anymore. Okay, so let's try to understand k-means using a very simple example here. So again, we have these, this is a data set we have, and these are your sample points. Okay, so each of these dot is a sample. Again, like this is projection on 2D space. You can easily generalize it to high dimensional space. So these are all the samples, and let's say we have 3 different clusters. And again, as I said, this is like a limitation of k-means. We need to know beforehand how many clusters we want. The first one is blue, the red one, and the pink one. Now what we do, we randomly initialize these centers among these points. Okay, so we know this Euclidean space. We will randomly put these centers somewhere. Okay, so that's the starting point. Now, once that is done, we try to assign each of the sample point to these centers. And that's basically based on how similar that sample is to this cluster center. And in this case, since this is Euclidean space, we can just use the distance from this point to the center. Now, if you do that, you see that all these points, which are actually closer to this blue square here, all they will be blue. Now, these 2 points were closer to the red one, so these are marked as red. And all these 4 were closer to the pink one, they are marked as pink. So that's like one step of your k-means clustering algorithm. Okay, so in that first step, what you did, you randomly initialize your centers, and then you assign every sample to these centers based on the closeness or the similarity. Now, what you do, you keep repeating this process over and over again. Okay, now in the second step, what will happen, you will take all these blue points and you will try to update the center, the cluster center. And that will basically be the mean of all these points. Okay, so you can look at like all these blue points. If you compute the mean, so the mean will be like in the x direction and the y direction, depending upon what are the x and y coordinates of these points. So you can see like the cluster center was at this location, it moved to this location. You will do the same for red cluster, and you can see it's basically at the center of these 2 points because you only have 2 points and the average is going to be at the center. Similarly, for the pink one, this will be the center based on these 4 points. Right, now you again reassign. What you will do, you will go through each of the sample points, you will find the distance from all the cluster centers, and again you will do the reassignment. So basically all these 4 points are again going to be blue, but this point over here, now it's actually closer to this red point, right? So this is going to be red, and these assignments are not going to change, okay, because these are still closer to the pink one. So that's the second step. You again repeat the same process. You will find the center, and you can see that the center for the pink is not going to change because the assignment was not updated, but the center for red will change because we have a new point now. Okay, so this will come maybe to this point, and blue might change because this was snatched away and the red took it. Okay, so it will move, and again you will do reassignment. And this point again is claimed by this one because it's closer to that center. And you keep repeating that. And unless like if the points are not changing, the centers are not changing, you say that, okay, we are done now. And at the end, you can see that you have 3 different clusters, the blue one, the red one, the pink one. And you can say like all these points belong to one category, which is blue. This belongs to red category. This belongs to pink category. And this was completely unsupervised. Okay. Now, so that was like the simple algorithm. As I said, it's iterative. And we have to like perform those 2 steps like in each iteration, which is kind of readjusting the cluster center and then again performing the reassignment. Okay, so for that, like again, we need a distance measure. In this case, we can just use the distance between those 2 points because it's Euclidean space. But you can imagine like if you are working in terms of features, which will be like high dimensional, for example, 5.2 dimensional or something. But again, in that case, you can compute the Euclidean distance between those 2 points, right? So that will still be valid. Okay, so the first question is what distance measure. Most of the times you will use Euclidean distance because you are working in terms of features. So for spatial data, that's actually that works pretty well. The another interesting question is, so the demo we discussed, we started like the points initially. Initially, we started it randomly, right? We just choose like any points. And then you can imagine this kind of algorithm is not deterministic, because what will happen is the initialization step is random, which means that if you run this algorithm multiple times, you might end up with different results, and that actually happens a lot. Okay, so different results will be different. So there are like different ways to address that, and one way is you can actually choose like some of these points as the initial point instead of just randomly picking it. Okay, so that's one solution. But again, that still makes it like makes it deterministic, because again you're choosing those points randomly. But the other way you can do is maybe you can take like some kind of averaging of multiple points together, right? So there are different ways to resolve this, but still like there is some kind of stochasticity there, which makes it like non-deterministic. So yeah, I think all this is good. That's mean calculation, that's fine. Yeah, so this is an interesting point. Like, so when you are running that algorithm iteratively, essentially the loss function which you're trying to minimize, you're not explicitly minimizing this, but essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to minimize the distance of every sample between every sample to its assigned cluster center, right? So that's what you're trying to minimize. Because if that distance is not minimal, then you can assign that sample to some other cluster center, if that is the minimal one. And that's the whole objective, right? That's how you do the reassignment. And basically, if you think about this, each iteration, you have to compute distance of each sample to all the cluster centers, which means that we'll compute that distance and then we have to perform some kind of sorting. And then you will pick like the shortest distance. And this is exactly showing you that the distance of each sample to the assigned cluster center. Okay, and then you add like all those distances for all the samples. And that's like what you can say, if you want to say like a loss function or something, which will get minimized. All right, so these are some of the variations, or you can say the parameters you have to choose. The first one is how many cluster centers to use. And that's like, I will say, one of the biggest limitation of k-means, because since this is like an unsupervised algorithm, most of the time we don't know how many clusters we have. So that is something which can be estimated. And one simple solution is you can actually try different number of centers and just run that algorithm multiple times. And then you can compute that loss function. And for whichever number the loss function is actually minimal, you can choose that as a solution. Okay. The other issue is when to stop. The demo which we discussed, it was easy because the the cluster center was not changing. So we can stop because there's no point in performing like more iterations, right? There's nothing happening there. Everything is fixed. The other way is you can actually fix the number of iterations. So for example, you have some kind of computation restrictions. So you can limit, okay, we'll only perform 10 iterations or 20 iterations, and then we will stop. And again, like if the cluster centers are not changing, or you can say also like partitions are not changing. For example, the points are not jumping between like different cluster centers. That could be like a good convergence criteria as well. All right, so the initialization, as I said, it plays a very big role, because since it is done it is done randomly. So for example, if you have this kind of initialization, right, second point and third point, there is no way like these cluster centers are actually going to move around to this side. So basically you will just get like a big cluster like this, okay, and then these 3 points will have to be divided between these two, and most likely I think this will be one cluster center with just 1 point, and these two might be another one, depending upon like how far they are from these cluster centers. So again, you can see like the initialization makes a big difference. Okay. And these are like some of the heuristics which can be used. As I said, you try like multiple starting points, right? And then you can compute like that loss function for whichever try like you are getting the minimum loss function. You just choose that as a result. Okay, so again, randomly picking examples, that was another variation which we discussed. This is interesting. What you can do is you can divide your Euclidean space like into different segments, right? And then make sure that whenever you choose your center, it belongs to one of those segments. So that way you are making sure that at least your centers are actually spread out equally in your data points, within your data points, right? So that's like a good heuristic which can be used sometimes. Okay, so that's k-means clustering. Now let's see how that can be used for image segmentation. And basically this is just one slide I have, and you have seen like how simple that k-means algorithm is. And now you will see like how simple this SLIC algorithm is. So this was proposed in 2012. And so the idea is you will use this k-means clustering over images, and the pixels of the images will be your sample points. Okay, so for example, if you have like, let's say 300 cross 300 image, so you will have that many pixels, and basically each pixel is your data point. And what you're going to do is you're going to use some kind of properties of that pixel, and basically it could be like the RGB color. All right, so those 3 values, and it could be the location of that pixel, where exactly that pixel is located in this image. Okay, so we use those 5 different values. So in this case, your feature vector is 5-dimensional, R, G, B, and then X and Y. XY is for the position of the pixel, RGB is for the color component. And later we'll see we don't use RGB color space. We use like a different lab color space, which is fine. You can use any other color space as well, HSV or something else. But the idea is to use the appearance. Okay, so then each pixel is represented using this feature vector, which is 5-dimensional long. And then we just run this k-means clustering using those data points. Now, one interesting question to ask is, what is the role of number of cluster centers? Now, the number of cluster centers will determine how many segments you will get in your segmented image. For example, if you set your number of cluster centers to 1000, then you're going to get 1000 different segments in that image, okay, which could be something like this on the top left, right? And as you keep reducing the number of cluster centers, you can see that your segments are actually getting bigger and fewer in number. And as you go down, you can see like this is even like coarser, so your segments are much bigger. And you can see like how clean these results are. And that's one of the reasons like this algorithm is still used today for like lot of applications. And we are using this for, I think, several of our research projects as well. So it's very simple algorithm, very efficient, gives you very good results. Okay, so this is like the input is an image, the algorithm is k-means, and this is going to be your output. Now let's see step by step like how this kind of output can be generated. What we do, we first of all initialize the cluster centers. So that's the first step for a k-means algorithm. Okay. And the way we do it is we divide your image into like multiple grids depending upon how many cluster centers you want. For example, if you want 100 different cluster centers, you will create a grid of 10 cross 10. And then within each grid cell, you will randomly pick one of the pixel as a cluster center. Okay. And as I said earlier, you will have a 5-dimensional feature vector. You will have 3 for colors and x5 for position. We need position because it may happen that, for example, like pixel over here, if it's like very dark pixel, the values might be 0, 0, and 0. Similarly, the pixels over here, they are also 0, 0, 0. If we just use color, they will be clustered together, but there's no way they are like the same segment, right? They're far apart in the image. And that's why we need like this position value as a feature. Okay, we want like pixels which are close to each other as one segment. Okay, so the second step, and again, this is ideally not required. It's just again a heuristic. Even if you skip this, it's not going to change like a lot in terms of result. And the idea is we first try to compute like the gradient of the image, and whatever cluster center we have initialized, we move it to a location where we have the smallest gradient. Okay, so let's try to understand why this step is required. As I said, I mean, for some images, it might like change the performance, but most of the times it won't do a lot. Okay, but let's try to understand the intuition. So you have seen that when you compute gradients in your image, then if there is a high gradient, it means that the color values might be changing a lot, right? So that might be an edge, and that's what you use for edge detection algorithm. So if gradient is high, then if it's an edge, which means that you're at a boundary of like 2 different segments. And that's not like a good initialization because then you don't know like which way to go. And that's why what we do is we simply shift the cluster centers to like a smallest gradient. And if the gradient is low, we know that, okay, it's not an edge and it might be like a same segment. Okay, so we just try to move towards the center of the segment. So that's the second step, and it's just done once. So again, the first step is done once, then this is also once. Then this is like the iteration for the k-means algorithm, which will be repeated again and again to refine the results. Okay, so again, this is like the traditional like step which we do for k-means clustering. What we will do is we will compute like the cluster assignment. So for each pixel location, we will compute the distance using these set of features, which are 5 different values. And we will use that distance to actually assign the cluster center. Okay, so this is the cluster assignment. And then again, what we will do is we will recompute the center of the cluster, right, based on the new assignments we have. And that will shift your cluster center. Okay, so these are the 2 traditional steps in k-means. We just keep repeating those 2 steps until we can have like some kind of stopping criteria, whether we want to stop after 10 iteration, 20 iteration, or we can stop like when the cluster centers are not changing. And at the end, you will get like this nice quality result. And you can see that these segments are solely based on the color value, right? And also like if they're close to each other, they are actually grouped into the same segment. One thing you will notice is 2 segments which are close to each other, even if the colors are similar, they are actually separate cluster centers. And the reason is because distance also plays a role. And you can see like most of the time, you will see like a straight line dividing those 2 segments. Okay. And if you want to relate that to I think one of the algorithm which we discussed, the k nearest neighbor algorithm, right? How the decision boundary looks like. So these straight lines actually explain like those decision boundaries. So this will happen only where like you have uniform color, not for like other locations where there's some gradient or something. Okay, so I think some interesting properties about this algorithm, it's pretty fast to run, even for like images of this resolution. It can be like done in fraction of seconds. And that's why it's used for like in a lot of real-time applications. If you need like regular superpixels, it's very useful. So these segments are actually called superpixels. Okay. Now, some of the downsides, like you might miss some of the thin objects. Because if you think about this, color is a factor which is playing an important role when you're creating these clusters, but then distance is also important. So because of distance, most of the time you will see that the segments are actually rounded shaped, right? Because that will make it uniform. And that's why like if your objects are like have thin shape, they will be ignored. So to take into that into account, what you can do is when you are computing the distance between like the cluster center and the pixel point, you can actually assign some kind of weights to colors and position. Okay, so let's say you want to pay less attention to the distance, more attention to the color, then it may happen that, okay, your segments will not be like rounded shape. Then you will get like all odd kind of shapes as well. All right, so yeah, that was SLIC, and let's quickly move on to mean shift, and then we will take like all the questions at the end. Now, one limitation of k-means is you need to know like how many cluster centers you want. Okay, and the second algorithm which we are going to discuss, which is mean shift, it actually tries to resolve that. So this algorithm will automatically figure out how many cluster centers we have. And again, this is a clustering algorithm. And these are like some sample results from this mean shift algorithm. We will briefly go over how this algorithm works. But now if you compare this with like the SLIC algorithm, which we discussed, it's quite different, right? It's able to like create bigger segments for you if they are similar. For example, this lake and these trees over here, right? So if you are interested in like getting these kind of outputs where there's some kind of semantic meaning to these patches, then mean shift is actually better than SLIC, because SLIC is just giving you over clustering. It's just dividing all the patches. Okay. Now let's try to understand how mean shift work. First of all, it's trying to address the issue of number of clusters, which was required in k-mean. So we don't need to know like how many cluster centers we have. We'll try to automatically detect that. And the main idea behind mean shift is it tries to find the density in your data. Okay. Now let's try to understand what that means. For example, this input image over here, right? If you will take each pixel location and let's say you have some kind of you're just looking at the intensity of each pixel, right? So it might look something like this if you plot like a scattered visualization of these pixels. Okay, so I think this is showing you this is the lab space, I think here. So V is like the intensity. And I think this is HSV space. So this is giving you like the color value, the hue, and V is like the brightness of the pixel, and the third one is the saturation of the pixel. Okay, so basically you are just trying to plot each point into this three-dimensional space. You could have done with RGB as well, which is perfectly fine. Now, what I wanted to show here is, if you look at these points, so each of these point belongs to like one of the pixels in this image. Okay. Now, if you carefully look at this distribution, you can see like there is a highly dense region here, right? And all these points are then scattered. You might say, okay, this is a dense region here as well. Then again, a dense region here. So what mean shift tries to do is it tries to find these denser regions, and these are like treated as distributions. So then what mean shift will say that, okay, this is some kind of distribution, and all the points which are actually inside this region, they are sampled from this distribution. Okay, so it's kind of trying to do distribution modeling. and which is quite different from like the way SLIC was working. Because in this case, like the distribution of the points will play a very, very major role. Okay, so these are also called, you can say like local maxima or some kind of modes. Okay, so wherever you have this high density, you say that, okay, this is one of the mode in your input image. And these might be like based on the colors you have. For example, if you have yellow color, you will get like one mode for yellow color, maybe one mode for white color, one mode for pink color. So whatever different distributions you have, which can form like some kind of grouping, this algorithm is going to figure those things out automatically. Okay, another interesting example over here. You can see that, for example, this dark circle here. So all these pixels which are inside this circle, they're forming this tight group, right? And this is just one segment. And if you have to say, okay, from which distribution this is coming, all these pixels will be like very close to each other. If you try to plot, let's say, some kind of histogram from these pixel values. All right. So what mean shift tries to do is it tries to find out center of such distributions. Okay, for example, let's say this is some kind of initialization. You have this red box. It will try to move towards the center of that distribution. So for example, if this blue bar chart over here is just showing you the histogram of the pixels you have at this region, right? So what this mean shift will try to do is it will try to fit this box perfectly on this distribution. Okay, and again, this is an iterative approach, and the idea is like, okay, let me quickly jump to the algorithm itself. I think it will be a lot easier to understand. So again, this is like, let's say your sample points. And what we do is we again start from like some random location. And we try to find like some kind of like the mode for the from the data. So we try to move that initial location to the densest region we can have in the samples. Okay, for example, let's say we start from this point. Now, one interesting parameter you still have this in this algorithm is the search window. Okay, how big your search window is going to be, and that will control how big your segments will be. If you use a very big search window, which means you are like maybe searching the entire image, then your segments might cover like the whole image. But if your search window is very small, then again, you're trying to find maybe small segments within your image. Okay, so you have this parameter, which is called search window. Now you start with the random location, you have some parameter for the search window. Let's say you have this radius. So this will be a search window. Then what you will do is within this region, you will try to find out where is the highest density inside this search window. And we can visually see that it's somewhere here, right? And you can easily compute that by computing the mean of all these points. Okay, so that's, you can also say like kind of a center of mass. So what we do is when we iterate like in this algorithm, we try to move these randomly initialized points toward these high dense regions. And this is called like mean shift vector, because what we are doing is we are computing the mean and then we are shifting the initialized center towards this mean. Okay. So we go there and then we repeat the process again. And then you can easily visualize what's happening here is we are just trying to move towards the denser region in your data. And we will stop like when the mean shift vector is not changing at all. Okay, so then this is going to give you center for one of the mode. And the idea is whatever pixels actually we moved through to obtain this center, all those pixels will actually belong to that center. Right? Because if these pixels didn't belong to this center, then when we are initializing at this location, we might have went to some other direction. Okay, but we followed this direction, which means that whatever pixels are on the way, they actually belong to this particular mode. Okay, so that's one important thing. The second important thing is we might end up, when we start with multiple points, we might end up at the same mode, at the same location. And in that case, what we do is we just merge those two segments together. So what might happen is we might have started at this location as well because we are doing it randomly. Then that might have also end up at this location. And all those pixels will also belong to this particular segment. Okay, so what we do, we start with like multiple locations, and then we will reach at a location which is called like the mode. And then all the starting points which are merging to the same location, they will be merged as a segment. And of course, we'll merge to like different modes if we have multiple modes. And each of those modes is going to give you one of the segment. Okay, so this bandwidth is like the search window, which is a very important factor. And basically, this is the algorithm which we just discussed. We start with like some of the kernels which are initialized randomly. We have some search window, and for each search window, we compute the mean. We compute the mean shift vector, move in that direction, and keep repeating this until the algorithm is converged. So there are some similarities to how k-means algorithm work. Okay. So yeah, I think all this is fine. So this is just showing you the trajectory, like how if this was initialized at this point, how this moved. And basically all these points which are inside this trajectory will be part of the same segment. Okay, so that was clustering algorithm. And that's again a very, very general algorithm which is used for image segmentation. Now, how we can use that for image segmentation? It's the same analogy we see for like how we do k-means to SLIC. We'll do the same thing here. Your pixels are actually your sample points, and you can use like the color values. And of course, you have the location. And then within your image, again, you will do random initialization of all those kernels. You will have some kind of search window. And for each search window, you will just repeat those steps. And of course, in this case, one interesting aspect is you can actually run those two steps in parallel for all the initialized points. There is no dependency. And once each point is converged, later you can easily merge points which are actually converging to the same mode. Okay, so that makes like the algorithm very efficient as well. So, and again, this is showing one simple visualization how you can find like different modes, right? And this is again from the image which I showed you earlier. This is just like a 2D projection of that 3D space. And this is along with the colors. You can see like yellow color over here, then blue, then pink. Okay, and how each of these colors is actually trying to get like separate modes. And these red dots are like the identified modes using mean shift. So here you can see that in this like hilly visualization, the higher the point, the denser that point is. And you can see that it's very dense over here, right? So this high density region is actually reflected by this part over here. And at the top is like your mode. And you can see that peaks of like these distributions is actually one of the modes. Okay. Now let's quickly look at like some sample images, how mean shift gives you segmentation. So this is the input image, and you can get something like this. Okay, so this is just showing like different colors, and you can see like the whole green patch over here was detected as one segment, which is quite different from the result which we expect from a SLIC kind of algorithm, right? So one interesting difference between mean shift and SLIC is SLIC will give you like irregular shaped segments, those superpixels, right? So the size of those superpixels won't change a lot. More or less, it will be similar for different segments. But that's not the case with mean shift. It will depend upon like how big the object is. Okay, you have stone like this, which is pretty small, but you have bigger segments as well. Okay, so again, this is a very nice visualization of a mean shift. So this is a colored image, and these are all RGB points visualized like in the 3D space. Now you can see that when mean shift was operated over this, you will find like different modes there, right? And that's exactly is shown in the bottom figure here. So you just converted like, this is kind of, you're trying to discretize your pixel values. Okay, so in this case, you have just this flat red, but in this case, you have variations of red, right? But when you make that flat, you just get one segment here. And again, this is a pretty nice example from real world image, right? It's very noisy, but still that algorithm is very, very robust. And you can see like how different modes are actually converging. So you started from different locations. So for some points, it converged pretty quickly, but for some points, it's still trying to converge. Okay, so now we are done. So you can see like this is kind of several iterations, maybe 80 or 100 iterations. And then the idea is like wherever these pixels were actually moving when we were converging, all of them actually belong to that particular segment. And you can get like with that kind of convergence, this is the result you will get. Maybe you can see like pretty decent, right? Some of the text is actually also segmented. Okay, so the good thing about mean shift is we don't need like any estimation of how many clusters we have to we have to determine, right? It will do it automatically for you. And it doesn't matter like how many modes you have in your color. So for example, some images might have just 2 modes or 2 segments. It will work in that case as well. Some images might have hundreds of different segments. It will operate in that case as well. And very robust to outliers, because you can see, because we are trying to compute like mean over a larger area, right? So even if we have some outliers as pixels, I think they will be easily filtered out. And we only need one parameter, which is like the window size. What should be your search size, and which is kind of reasonable because you know that how big your segments should be. So depending upon that, you can easily set that window size. Okay, some of the drawbacks, not drawbacks, but again, I will say properties. The output will depend highly on the window size, and that's fine. It's computationally expensive because again, it's iterative, and you can imagine like each step you have to compute that mean. Okay, and depending upon like how many initialization points you have, you'll have to do that for all of those points. So the idea is like if you have very high dimensional data, so for images, it's fine. If you're just using like, let's say the colors of the position, it's 5-dimensional vector. But if it's high dimensional space, for example, 1000-dimensional space, it can be very, very computationally expensive. So not easily scalable.